Greetings, everybody, and welcome back to Gaming Materialists. This is Revolution and VarnVlog's monthly discussion of games, nerd cultures, and all things geek. And today we have an exciting show, but sadly we are missing Discourse today. Discourse is streaming live because Games Workshop is doing its big announcement for 10th edition. We may know soon. We'll probably know by the time this video is out. But even though she cannot be with us today, she will be with us here in spirit. And of course, I am joined by the one, the only C. Derek Vaughn. Hey, C. Derek Vaughn, how are you doing?
I'm okay. It's a slow morning, but I'm doing well. I'm on Team Doom for D&D, so.
Oh, you're on Team Doom for D&D. So yeah. So our topic for today, Vaughn, do you want to give us a little bit of background before we bring our guest in?
Well, I think our topic for today is One D&D and the future of D&D products, and between the fact that they seem to be investing a lot on a very specific kind of online roleplay that has a lot of computer requirements and will probably entail a lot of not just, monetizations, but sub-monetizations and small monetizations. I think about my experience with official D&D cell phone games, which are all kind of a money suck nightmare. But also that the actual book products recently have come out feeling frankly unfinished. And so I am not particularly hopeful, but it also, this in the past has not been that big a deal because there's been a third-party market kind of making up the gap for anything that isn't really working in the books. That will probably also be a lot harder to do in the upcoming environment.
Well, let's bring our guest in for the day. He is the master of DungonMasterpiece YouTube channel, which is a YouTube channel that is dedicated to helping you be a better dungeon master. He is also a trained, I want to say, international relations specialist who also uses his training in international specialists to unlame roleplay game settings, which usually have a terrible concept of geopolitics and class politics and so on and so forth. He is the one, the only Baron de Ropp. Hey,
Hi.
how are you doing? Welcome.
Thank you. Thanks for having me. It's great to be here.
Well, it's a real pleasure, and thank you for joining us today. So, as Vaughn kind of laid out at the beginning, there's a lot of talk about something called One D&D. So, people who may be familiar with Dungeons and Dragons as a tabletop role play game, could you outline, considering that you've discussed this on your YouTube channel and you are skeptical about what One D&D is, can you tell people who are not super familiar what One D&D is, who are not following the D&D news but may role play other games, what is One D&D? Why is it called One D&D? Why isn't it called 6th edition Dungeons and Dragons? What's the background behind it, and what is the change from previous editions?
So, One D&D is supposed to be a just kind of a repolish, a remix up, a reshuffle of 5th edition in order to do two things, in my personal opinion, that I've been able to observe so far. One, it's to simplify specific rules, so that the game is easier to play. However, the simplification is also designed to create a foundation that more crunch can be easily added onto the game in order to facilitate the sales of more crunchy rule books. So basically, we're going to see a simplification of the most baseline parts of the character creation process and combat rules in general. However, we're going to also see more crunch or more specificity in detail of the 5th edition mechanics as it relates to particular character classes, character abilities, etc. It's kind of like the relationship that third edition had with 3.5 and Pathfinder. If you were to, 3.5 was more of just a rules repolish. They realized they got a few things wrong that were highly unbalanced. They republished the rules with the cleanup, and that was that. And then Pathfinder came along when they went to fourth edition and basically created third edition again, but better. And I think that's what we're exactly going to see with fifth edition, is kind of the relationship that Pathfinder First Ed had with third edition. It's not necessarily if you blur your eyes, everything's going to be backward compatible. But they're not trying to throw the baby out with the bathwater per se. Everything is still going to be backward compatible. All your old fifth edition stuff is still going to work fine, but it's basically just a new framework or a reorganization. Basically, quite frankly, honest, to be a sales engine for more player character option crunch.
Do you think? Do you think this rules change is needed? This re-edition is needed in general. I mean, you mentioned that you see it as a way to sell more books, but do you think there is some utility to the changes that they're making as an iteration rather than a new edition?
I think that's kind of a loaded question, and I say that because you can go looking through drive-through RPG, and there's a niche RPG for just about everything. So like when we say like, is it needed? Well, what problem are we solving? And that's why I say like, is the need selling more books? Then yes, it's needed. Because and you can see even how much their sales have slowed down on some of these books. On what rudimentary figures you can get, the stuff that's selling at the player's guide and the starter kit, and nothing else is really doing it. So if you go look in their annual reports and whatnot, is it needed from a cultural standpoint? I think fifth edition's fine for what it is. It's pretty well balanced. I don't see anything that is immediately broken that needs, like, there isn't a gameplay problem that needs to be solved. I feel like they did a good job when they were first publishing fifth edition to play test it, and it is a really cohesive system. Like when it comes to the editions of Dungeons and Dragons, just throw my own opinion out there. I am just as much a fan of BX Moldvay as I am fifth edition. I play both of them equally. So and which is really funny because I get a lot of people telling me that I'm like this, OSR gatekeeper, which is laughable because all my channel tries to do is take like elements of the OSR concept and bring it into fifth edition. But but is it needed? What's the goal? And does it solve that goal?
So what you would say is, in terms of a rule set, and I think this is a pretty fair assessment, fifth edition does what it's supposed to do. I mean, in terms of a genre of role play game, I have some issues with it because of the power levels, because of the superheroification of first level characters. But as a rule set itself, the core mechanics are quite easy to learn. Everybody can play them. It's not super complicated. Character creation isn't particularly difficult. And at the end of the day, if you don't like certain aspects of the game, the characters being too powerful, you can either make the things that they're fighting way more powerful, or you can kind of nerf the. I mean, I believe there's something I've used before, which is called D&D Hardcore Edition, which is just
by Hanker Inferno.
Yeah, it's it's just a good way to like tone down some of the power levels. So, I would tend to agree, in terms of a rule set, it does what it's supposed to do. It might not be everybody's cup of tea, but it's a good rule set. Would you agree with that, Varn?
Oh yeah, I think it's fine as a rule set, and well, I think its base rule set is actually fine. One thing I can say is addendum rules have been largely incoherent, and that's not unique to fifth edition. It's actually kind of weird that like third edition was and 3.5 was better on that. That's my only real complaint, is that you have these modular projects that have rules that are largely incomplete or don't play well with one another. I think the biggest example would be when you find like ship rules in the various sea campaigns, like the Saltmarsh book, or the mostly the Saltmarsh book, and then you have ship rules and Spelljammer are the lack thereof, and they don't seem consistent at all. That isn't unique. If people are familiar with like the end of first edition and the beginning of second edition, you have second edition AD&D, you have similar problems where you have just rules that are developed by people on one project that aren't really cohesively integrated. That has become a problem in 5th ed, but as far as the base rule set, actually is pretty great. Like I was a skeptic. I came to 5th edition very late. I was a holdout because I was burnt by 4th, and I was burnt by just the rules creep of 3.5 too, honestly. And this edition seems to have been much better on that, but there are a couple. There's been a couple of trends that have concerned me, particularly with the way they use Unearthed Arcana announcements and kind of playtest through that. And then, like I said, the finished products don't really have cohesive visions at all. So as far as what it is what it is. I like that. One thing that I have liked, is a major change from 3rd edition and even maybe 4th edition, is that world building has been prioritized, but largely set on the DM. And while there are things like it mentions stuff from the 70s and 80s in books and never even like really goes, like I've seen them throw off Greyhawk as a world, and I'm just like, well, but who's not 40 knows anything about that? But beyond that, I think the world building's been kind of also nice and modular and open for other developers to come in and do stuff, and I think that's been good. I get a feeling that may change with One D&D actually, but maybe I'm wrong about that. But I will also say a lot of these books do feel to me to be increasingly incomplete, even though they're bigger box sets, which that seems to be driving them. Like I can't for the life of me figure out. I know I've been harping on it all day, but the Spelljammer thing was like such a surprise to me, how unfinished that product felt, despite being 3 books, and the page count of the books being actually quite low.
Any thoughts, Baron, on the products that Wizards of the Coast have been putting out with 5th edition? Any trends that you're noticing with it?
Yeah, so you kind of touched on a few things I'll comment to. One of them is using the Unearthed Arcana and player response surveys as the basis for developing the product. And I feel like that is an extremely folly and flawed way of handling customer feedback. And a far better methodology would be to find players in game stores who are very casual players and focus group them. And I say that because the people who respond to surveys are the people who are generally very interested in the meticulous mechanics of the rules and are very eager to make sure that their voices are heard. And that's a very small percentage of players that actually perceive Dungeons and Dragons in that methodology. Most people just want to show up and, throw some dice, drink some beer, eat some pretzels, and play a game, crack goblin skulls. That's 99% of the players. So taking user response from surveys is basically only listening to the most loud and obnoxious 1% of players that are participating in that feedback. And, to the people who might, scoff at me saying that. And there's nothing wrong with being engaged in the product and wanting to make sure that your voice gets heard. However, this kind of problem that I'm illustrating, I say it's a problem because it's what killed the RTS industry. And the only thing that's still alive now is StarCraft 2. And it's limping on, 10 years later? It's just barely limping on. And the reason is because the RTS industry was constantly taking feedback from the most engaged, most professional, most competitive gamers, and they left everything that the casual gamer, which was 95% of their consumer base, they left 95% of their consumer base basically ignored, who were just casual gamers that wanted something fun to do after work and play through a storyline. So the solo casual mode got completely squashed, and all the statistics for all the little different fiddly behaviors of the Zerg and Marines was fine-tuned to the nth degree, but the casual players never even see the payout on that. They don't even know that happened. So to double back to 5th edition, I was also talking with another YouTuber and blogger by the name of Justin Alexander. He has a YouTube channel and a blog, both called The Alexandrian. And we had a passing conversation, and he mentioned something that really jumped out to me. He said, all the stuff that looks incomplete, it's actually not. It's that they are creating the content with the intent or with the practice that it will be used in a virtual tabletop environment. And the moment you throw a virtual map on a screen and start going through these modules that have been recently published, and this is especially true with Rime of the Frostmaiden, you suddenly realize that there's all kinds of details that you would expect to find in a book that are just apparently on a virtual map of the setting that people can just look at. So, I feel like they're they're practicing catering to that virtual space. And it may be that they've done some market research and have found that the vast bulk of people who participate in, tabletop role-playing at an actual table are people who are building their own worlds, and largely they can ignore, if that makes sense.
That makes a lot of sense. I mean, this is a very interesting trend, and we'll get.
And that's just my hyperbole, by the way. Like, I have that's just an assumption based on things I've seen. I have no data to corroborate that statement. So,
but that would make a lot more sense, though.
I mean, it fits in
Right.
with a broader pattern. I think this is a good point to pivot to the other important aspect of One D&D, which is the integration of the virtual tabletop. Now, it's my suspicion, and maybe you guys disagree with me, that this notion of the virtual tabletop explains a lot about 4th edition D&D, which I think somehow might have worked as a rule set quite well on a virtual tabletop. People complained that it was too World of Warcrafty, but I do remember reading that they did have plans to have like a proper virtual tabletop to role play with 4th edition.
Yeah.
But now obviously there's been technological advances which make that more plausible, and I think more importantly, virtual tabletop software has become widespread. Role playing using virtual tabletops, and for people who don't know, for people who still role play in the old fashioned way, it's now possible to get a piece of software, Roll20, Foundry. There's a fantasy grounds. These are all softwares that allow you to integrate to conduct your role play games online. Companies produce resources to support these online tabletops, but these are third-party softwares, not controlled by Wizards of the Coast. And another important aspect of One D&D, which is something you talk about in your video about One D&D, which will be in the description of this episode, is this new virtual tabletop. And I'm just going to pull up some pictures for people to have a look at. You can take a look at what we're talking about. This is a picture of their virtual tabletop. You can see you have your fake little minis there. and we have some more, measuring devices. So basically, this is what a virtual tabletop looks like, but this version of a virtual tabletop is, in graphical terms, way above what exists at the moment. So, Baron, could you talk to us a little bit about this online aspect of One D&D, what it means, and why you're skeptical of it?
It's not that I'm skeptical of a virtual play space. A virtual play space is fine. If you want a virtual play space, that's completely acceptable. I don't have any issue with Foundry or Roll20 or Tailspire or any of those third-party softwares that do this sort of thing. What I am, and it's not that even that I'm skeptical, and for the clickbait, my video is very doom and gloom. It's that I'm always the kind of person who looks at how today's solution is going to be tomorrow's problem. And the thing that I see here is we have especially thanks to the pandemic, you've got a lot of people who want to be able to play D&D as if it were a video game. This is very much a thing with Gen Z, they've been raised on smartphones and tablets since they were toddlers. That kind of virtual integration is just something they're accustomed to, but they're not old enough. They're going to scoff when I say this. They're not old enough to watch software die, like just disappear. And that's the real big issue here, is that this tabletop the virtual tabletop that Wizards of the Coast is creating, if it is successfully created, that's a big if. If it is successfully created, it will create this nexus center of gravity within the D&D ecosystem that will pull all the players, especially virtual casuals, into that ecosystem. And because of the way that the ecosystem will likely be constructed, where you have to pay for licensing for the books, for the characters, for the minis, for microtransaction poses, et cetera, you get more and more locked into that system. And what's more is that all of the adventure writing, all of the source materials that are third-party published, energy will be turned away from just simply writing an adventure. Like probably one of my favorite adventures is Caverns of Thracia, just as an example, written by Janelle Jacquez. And then probably my favorite starting adventure that I run players through is called A Most Potent Brew, and you can get that on DM's Guild. But those two adventures only exist in PDF format. I think A Most Potent Brew has a virtual tabletop version, and I think Goodman Games has a new 5th edition version for Caverns of Thracia as a virtual tabletop now.
They're at least developing it.
They're at least developing, and you can get it integrated into Roll20 or something like that. But in the future, the amount of actual labor and lift that has to be done in order to create something, if you want your stuff to be seen by people now, like let's say 3 years from now when this comes out, if you want your stuff to be seen by people now and talked about online and get recognition for the work that you're putting in, you're not gonna write an adventure as a PDF or as a book. You're gonna do it inside One D&D's virtual tabletop space. Cool. Well, that works for 5, maybe 8 years, but then the software dies and becomes vaporware. And now all of that stuff, all of that programming, all of those assets, all of those triggered events that you have programmed into this adventure dies with it. So, think about, what was your favorite video game when you were a kid, when you were like 12, 13 years old? And there are some video games that have stood the test of time, like Myst, for example, regularly gets remakes. But, one of my favorite RPGs, even Fallout 1, the original 1998 release of Fallout 1, it is a total pain to get that to run on a modern computer, even using good old games or something like that. And, is that what we want? One of the greatest classic RPGs to have happened to it, where you have to go and find a Windows XP computer on eBay just to run your favorite RPG, because that's where this is going to go, with a virtual tabletop ecosystem that is curated by Wizards of the Coast.
Yeah, I mean, this actually is an interesting comparison, because the virtual tabletop ecosystem, we were talking about the fourth edition. The fourth edition was clearly built on modeling an MMORPG ecosystem, which is different. And that's where the rule sets got so crazy. And you definitely, when you were playing that combat rules and they're nearly impossible to do, you're like, oh, with a computer, this would be done very quickly. But like when we actually sit down and play this at a table, it's going to take an hour and a half to run a combat scene, which is why all the people I know who like fourth edition didn't play it. But it's just like, or they played Feet of the Mind stuff. So I'm like, yeah, this is mostly combat rules. I have seen slowly since 3.5 like this tendency to go to the re-war gamification of D&D and D&D related RPGs in general, kind of off of the drive to get video gamers in, and that's clearly what fourth edition was trying to do. This is interesting to me because we had a technological fix, kind of ad hoc, fix the problem. And like many of the internet's current technological fixes, like Substack or streaming software or whatever, it's actually not new technology. It's actually kind of old technology that's been finally just figured out how to be pieced together. But it was done in a kind of ad hoc manner. Well, with One D&D coming in, and now we have an official form for that, everything's tied into that. The books are now written for that kind of gameplay. So even if you are a classic tabletop gamer, you're going to have to do a lot more work to make basic things run, because of the assumption that this will run in the program, and the program will have fixed all that for you, and you don't have to think about it. No more fourth ed problem with 5-hour long combat scenes. However, it also means that like the amount of work put into this becomes really prohibitive. And I think that also changes who is going to engage in writing third-party stuff, because I can tell you right now, people like me are just going to go do OSR stuff because it's just easier to do. I don't have to hire a coder.
Right.
It's already hard enough dealing with digital art and all this. And so it feels to me like a lot of this makes total sense for a short-term market share gain, but it makes no sense for longevity at all. I maybe I'm wrong about that. Maybe people are assuming that streaming patches and all this will stop software depletion, but I have not seen where that's actually been the case. So.
I think right now, as far as business sense goes, this is a strong move for WotC.
Mm-hmm.
Honestly, just because there's a market that is hungry for virtual table. Like one of the leading things that I saw in my comment section was how I'm being the evil bad guy because I'm telling people in my video that they're wrong for wanting to play virtually, which is not the case at all. They're more than welcome to play virtually. And they are new players that are playing virtually. I think what's interesting is that the marketing of Wizards of the Coast will always be making up, especially if they're not producing Hollywood blockbusters. That is now going to be the marketing for getting people to play D&D. It's part of the long-term ecosystem. So as long as their marketing strategy is constantly bringing in new players, that's not a big deal. It's kind of like the MCU or the Marvel universe thing. There's always going to be people who are interested in Marvel because they're always making new movies. So it's but that's not what I think is the issue here. It's that it's like a short-term gain and medium-term gain, but it's changing the way that D&D will have its longevity persevere, if that makes sense.
I think that's. I mean, I think this is an important point. I mean, we talked about the technological aspects of it, and
Mm-hmm.
and I think I think the first point that we all need to make, I think, is it is an open question whether this software will be functional or not. How successful it was, what its UI will be like, how easily will it be to adopt by people? Will it require a significant amount of processing power or something like that, which will make it unaccessible to many people? So the technical question is still an open question. We'll just have to see what Wizards of the Coast come up with. They may be successful, they may not be successful. But I think from an economic perspective, I think, the combination of this technology and the combination of a new set of economic incentives being injected into the system could have a very problematic effect on the role play community. For example, with third-party virtual tabletops, well, those are open to people playing other games. People can play all kind. Companies can produce modules for Foundation or Roll20. People aren't restricted to playing one particular game system. But I think Baron, you hinted at this. Wizards of the Coast is trying to monetize, try and find a constant money cow, because at some point you have an edition, you sell the core rule books, market becomes saturated, and core rule books numbers go down or aren't doing as well as they had previously done. Growth slows. You try selling extra books, but not everybody who buys those core editions wants to play in your pre-made world, and people like doing their own homebrews. So this offers an opportunity for massive monetization at a relatively low cost, low production costs. You're just basically creating virtual assets. You pay the virtual asset makers, and you do microtransactions, and you have an economy that is increasingly based on an ethereal product that is produced once and then replicated for virtually no cost. So obviously, this is a way to extract profit, but once people, like you say, are dumping money into their virtual collection of D&D assets, the likelihood that they are going to abandon those assets to play a different game is going to be lower. The fact that the virtual tabletop system that they're using is completely cut off from any other potential roleplay game, well, that too is going to have that's going to make it more difficult for people to access other roleplay games. There's been a kind of dialectic, if you will, with the rise of the internet and the OSR, is that in previous eras, D&D just dominated the roleplay game industry because D&D was the only thing that people had heard of. That broke in the 1990s, kind of came back in the early 2000s. But because, people have blogs, people have YouTube channels, you can learn about other games. But this is going to create a very powerful countervailing force, which is going to drive people more into the whole D&D and roleplay games are synonymous. I don't even know there's another roleplay game. It's like Games Workshop and tabletop war games. There are people out there who they think Games Workshop is the only people who ever made a tabletop war game miniature game, right?
Right.
Because
you either play 40K or you don't play anything.
Exactly. So this is going to create that tendency because, I mean, I'm sure it's not hurting their business at all, but more and more people are trying out OSR games, and these games are cheap. These games often have better rule sets, more refined rule sets, and more interesting. That pathway, that funnel where people might go from 5th edition D&D to start playing OSR games, there's going to be a block put on that. And I think that's deliberate.
So yeah, I mean, there's a lot going on here. I mean, one, you have a general tendency that this is not just true in the RPG market. This is true in all markets for people to want to get a ready income stream because actual profitability on actual commodities is kind of dicey. Um, that's just, you see that everywhere in the economy. It's not unique to gaming at all. And we saw the microtransaction stuff already hit, video games too. For the same reason, like microtransactions plus subscriptions have a much more steady income stream than. But what I find interesting about that is we're talking about how you get all this capture, and you're right about that. About the kind of market and development capture that you get with something like One D&D. But what I find interesting is in these systems, these virtual systems, most of them do eventually collapse. Like they just collapse under their own weight. You can't update the software to modern computers enough, or people get tired of all the micro investments and move on to something new. And that dynamic does not seem to have been factored into this. And I mean, we studied what happened with White Wolf, where it messing around with a game model like this completely destroyed the company and the publishing model, then broke up the rights. And so, like, I don't predict anything like that happening with D&D. Wizards of the Coast, aka Hasbro, has too much market share power. But at the same time, I do wonder if they could actually be like in the long run. What makes immediate business sense right now could actually be not just disastrous to the hobby and knock-on effects, but also disastrous to them when we hit the vaporware stage. And those two things together do worry me greatly, particularly if they're only writing products with the assumption that most of this will be done through their virtual tabletop format. And it seems like that's where they're going.
So, just to kind of follow back on some stuff that you guys have pointed out, you were saying that like the virtual tabletop platform is cheap. It's a easy marketing model, and I'm not sure that that's an accurate representation. Software developers are extremely expensive compared to game writers, and it takes quite a bit more many of them to do it. So, if it's going to be worth the investment, you're going to have to hire a crap ton of software developers in order to make a product like this happen. We're probably talking, $3 to $5 million worth of salary and in software and support annually at the bare minimum to make something viable. And that only makes sense if you've got Daddy Hasbro, chomping at the bit to get as many transactions as possible squeezed out of people. But when this does finally hit vaporware stage, there's gonna be another version of this out, and they're just gonna market it the same way. It's just marketing. It's basically going to become the video game churn, if that makes sense. Now, I think what you experience with White Wolf, and honestly what the entire RPG industry experienced in the year 1999 when TSR was, on its deathbed, by having these game system mix-ups or corporate mishandling of IPs, whatever it is, there is something that's going to happen eventually. Like, it's obviously going to happen eventually. Something cataclysmic is going to happen to the brand, and it will nearly destroy the entire tabletop industry again. Like, there were so many small game companies that just had to shutter their doors when TSR crashed and eventually got picked up by Wizards of the Coast, that were just kind of feeding off the fact that even though they weren't even making D&D content, they were just feeding off the fact that TSR was creating this gravity well that everybody else could orbit around. And so I already, for me, I start to see this happening now. How long is it before Games Workshop, before Wizards of the Coast pulls the plug on Wooden Bookshelf and says, "Hey, One Bookshelf, I'm pulling the plug on the license for Faerun and Ravenloft, and we're going to bring that over into our One D&D ecosystem. That's gone now. So now the only thing left for for One Bookshelf is Drive-Thru RPG. Well, it'll have some third-party content, but half of the third-party content stuff is now going to be made inside of One D&D. So now half of their inventory goes away. Sure, it'll still be there. It might be enough to keep the company going, but if you tell Roll20 that 60% of their customer base is now gone because they're going to be over in One D&D, VTT, I don't think there's a certain level of development and support that just costs, like, it's a floor. It costs X dollars to keep the developers' salary paid that are maintaining Roll20. Not that they do much, honestly. It's a pretty buggy platform, if you ask me. But just to keep that going, I'm not trying to throw shade on people. They should probably hire more people to clean the software up better. There's a threshold that has to be paid, and if you're not making a certain threshold, if Roll20 isn't able to make, $3.5 million a year, they can't keep the lights on. That's just the way it is, and so there's a, what is that threshold for all these other smaller companies in the ecosystem? And once the lights get turned on for One D&D, how many other lights get turned off? That's the question.
It's interesting because I'm going to put on my vulgar leftist economist hat here, because I see this problem in other industries where if you look at from the standpoint of income flows, things make sense. But when you look at it from the standpoint of what you really need to invest to keep the development clean, because Shannon information entropy is a motherfucker for anybody dealing with software, because you're going to have buggy code, data generation, whatever. That just happens. It's literally part of physics. You need people to invest time and energy to go and rewrite the software and clean it up. That's inevitable, right? And that's that's actually a hard ask, because you need now more and more infrastructure to maintain these simple income flows. The thing is, though, it does look like from the accounting end of things that these things are actually highly profitable in the beginning, because you don't spend that much except on marketing. But I want to ask you how many MMORPGs have ever successfully translated to multiple editions. And the answer is, I can't think of maybe but one.
Wow.
Like, if you think about it, and that's because of these kinds of trends. Software is very admin heavy for the reasons that we're talking about. Like,
yeah.
It is very costly to actually maintain, and while the initial profits on it are huge, if you can break that initial barrier of entry, which is pretty high, which you don't have. I mean, that's actually kind of why the OSR industry is so awesome. You don't have that barrier. Like, the barrier is pretty low. You don't need that much investment. You got to pay an artist. Like, that's pretty much usually it. Like,
and not even that. You just get some public domain art and slap it on there.
Right. Exactly.
But the point I would make from Wizards of the Coast perspective is precisely this. I mean, Baron, you're correct, obviously, that maintaining and paying the people to develop the software is much more expensive than developing having writers do things. Writers will work for like peanuts.
You can pay a writer $50,000 a year. Software developer is $200,000 in Seattle.
But the flip side is, of course, there's not really much production outlays to do. So you're not so dependent on commodity prices. You're not so dependent on like chains of production and things like that. So it takes a lot of the complexity out. So it's like a bigger investment upfront in maintenance, but the potential for meeting market demand. It's like, let's say you have a product that's wildly successful, and you sell out, you have to suddenly reinvest money in a new production run, which you don't know if that production run will sell out. With this,
That's fair.
You're just basically you can expand production of virtual items like without any outlay. So yes, you're paying this big upfront cost, which is something no one else can do, right? Because you're the big daddy company. And then you're also making it cheaper on another end because you can constantly expand without having to, you don't have to pay the software developer more if he produce, if you have 1 million copies or 10 million copies or 50 million copies. So I think there's that's the attraction of
right.
the virtual.
You move out of income based on scale, right? Profits become from a technical economic analysis, profits become rents, and that does seem more stable for a business because you just have to deal with your initial outputs and maintaining that staff. However, the other part of this that I mentioned that is a problem is that if you just look at the long-term viability of systems and games that are electronic, they almost all collapse in on themselves in a decade.
That's true,
like
but
a cycle.
You could also end up, if Hasbro has the money, and if this becomes successful, they could be the one that succeeds, just like World of Warcraft is still viable as a MMO, even as others have gone to the wall. Thoughts, Baron?
I think it's interesting to talk about it from a supply chain perspective. Asking people to pay for a book and then ordering it makes you reliant on a paper supply chain. Sure.
Mm-hmm.
The book supply chain, though, has very few inputs to be successful. And I honestly think that the supply chain for software is a much higher problem. If you're trying to create software that is maintained and up to date, you've got it becomes a human resources supply chain. It's no longer like you can hire a couple of artists and a couple of writers anywhere on the planet, especially if from Eastern Europe, where they're very well educated and work for a quarter of what Americans do, and get like that's basically the Magic the Gathering pipeline, is they pull from Latin America and from Eastern Europe quite often and develop an entire world in 6 months and publish it and have all the cards drop, so and then you look at the amount of money that they're spending on and the required inputs that go into MTG Arena. I'm not sure that it's really all that much different. And as far as complexity or management of what is needed in order to make the software work.
All that said, I also kind of think that One Shelf is sort of doomed.
Absolutely.
For a variety of reasons.
Yeah, it's going to be weird that Itch.io is the one that survives, and that's only because it's like it appears to. I don't know enough about Itch.io, but it appears that there's enough churn on Itch.io that they're not terribly concerned about the chaff that gets put on there. The anime dating sims that basically keep that platform alive. So, no offense to anime dating sim lovers, but AAA games, they are not.
Yeah, one of the things that really hurt Drive-Thru's model is they've had to move almost all electronic because people can't afford to buy their physical books anymore, and the quality of them, of the book build, is just not good. So, we've seen this with the Drive-Thru RPGs model as the print-on-demand model, but now it's got, because of it, even with international supply chain problems, having 1,000 books printed in China is still cheaper than, and you can still provide them cheaper than you can provide, I don't know, one book printed on Drive-Thru RPG of significant size, because that's now going to be like an $80 print, and right. that's not that's not DriveThruRPG's fault. That's just like the market demands, and economies of scale, which in my mind mirrors a whole lot of stuff we've seen prior to COVID, where everyone assumed that you could run stuff like you'd run software, and it seemed to pay off in the beginning, so you could offer cheap products because you didn't have to maintain or warehouse anything, and then all of a sudden you're dealing with the fact that you can't do it at economies of scale. And this good idea really wasn't actually all that good. We've seen that a lot, but we still have seen like I will say Kickstarter has managed for many companies to be able to put out a couple thousand issues of a game in nice editions, in quality. Like actually it's one of the things I was laughing about the other day. I was like, I have some like 80s and 90s RPG books, and I'm like, man, what a small company can put out now as a physical product for the price point when you adjust for inflation is crazy. Like, look at any of the new OSR products that have physical books. When you get those books, they are nice. They are better built than anything TSR could have done in the 80s or even the 90s.
No, for sure.
But this is actually going to be an interesting thing to me, because part of me wonders, like, are we going to go back to like the 90s, where are like maybe the aughts, actually the late aughts, where the indie gaming world was very much pivoted not as a supplement to Dungeons and Dragons, but because of their response to some of the changes in the open license code as being against it. And that was actually a very innovative time period. That's like when I try to like not be a doom and gloomer about this, I'm like, could that happen as this kind of separates out, and like we just think of these as separate worlds, like completely separate worlds?
Oh, it absolutely will. It absolutely will. And that is the problem. That's what my whole video's thesis is saying. And I feel like a lot of people miss the point of my video. I can't tell. It's probably 60% of the comments are like, this doesn't even bother me. I don't care. I'll just go play another game. Well, of course you're just going to go play another game. Of course you're just going to go make your own other game. That's fine. Go do it. The problem is that new players that are coming into the market will be so deeply entrenched and exposed to D&D through the one D&D VTT that they won't even know that there are things they can Google. Let alone not knowing what they can Google. It's that they won't even know that there are things that they can Google that will point them to other RPGs. They won't have any exposure to it whatsoever. They'll think that D&D is the tabletop RPG and that concept doesn't exist anywhere else. It'll probably, and they may go 15, 20 years of their life after being exposed to D&D before they even realize that Pathfinder was a thing or Call of Cthulhu was a thing. The two of the other largest games on the market.
Well, I mean, I think that's it's going to be an open question. I think the scenario that you lay out, Baron, is an entirely plausible scenario. But there are countervailing forces to this in terms of, for example, the way people get information now through YouTube, through other online mediums, makes it difficult to contain knowledge to the same degree. So that maybe
my studies on parallel actually says that the opposite is true. It's easier to contain knowledge when more of it is freely available, because no one knows how to find it. And that has very much been a trend on YouTube.
But it's going to be dependent. The kind of X factor in this point is, because of the role that influencers play in marketing these games, will the, let's say, on balance, the influence community pivot entirely towards Dungeons and Dragons, or will the influencer community be more diverse in exposing people to other kinds of games? So it comes down to, to use an analogy, what is the vanguard of roleplay games doing. There's like that's like if you have no, like you have a community of role players, you have tastemakers in that community who have enormous followings, and who what they say filters down into the broader community through word of mouth. It's going to be a question of what that kind of highly engaged influencer section of the roleplay community does. Like, for example, if let's say, what are the guys called, the ones that everybody watches? My brain.
Critical Role.
The what one? Critical Role.
Critical Role.
Yeah. Like if Critical Role starts playing, I don't know, Mothership, right? The role play game Mothership, and loads of people watching that. That's going to be a massive boost for thing. So
we have seen that before with Critical Role, even before they were so massive, dropping Pathfinder for fifth edition, which I think people even forget happened.
So
right.
So there are these X factors in which are like down to the agency of the community, and particularly of those at the forefront of the community in making taste. So I think Baron's scenario is plausible, but I think there are ways that this could not turn out in the way that we think it is, depending on the action of the community.
Sure.
So any final words then?
Yeah, I would be really skeptical. I would consider myself probably like the top end of C tier YouTuber in the D&D space, if that makes sense. And in this position, like, I regularly go into game stores, and just about every other time I go into a game store, I get recognized. It's happened now. I'll bump into people that are like, "Hey, you're Dungeon Masterpiece, right?" I get approached on the street now. I've got multiple videos with over 100,000 views, and I look at like who is in the D&D dungeon mastering advice niche on YouTube, who is bigger than me, and there's a handful of maybe a dozen, maybe 24 people, and it's like Matt Colville is probably the biggest one. Jenny D is in the A tier. Their videos are only clocking something like 250,000 views a video, and Matt Colville now, he's only, as far as view count goes now, he's not much bigger than myself. So I am very skeptical of how much influence these people have, except for maybe the very top tip of the iceberg, like you're talking about with Critical Role. The question then becomes is, can these small little game developers afford a ad placement on Critical Role that gets 2 million views, divide 2 million by 1,000, and then multiply that by $35 to $40? That's how much they're making off of every ad placement. Just to blow the socks off of everything out here. It's an easy formula to figure out. There's a formula for this, and can these companies afford, hey, I want you to run a one shot in my game system? Maybe they pick it up organically as a tastemaker, sure, but the fact that Critical Role dropped Pathfinder and goes to 5th edition just because that's what everyone is most familiar with, I'm just skeptical how much actual influence these smaller companies are going to have.
Yeah.
I can pip small. Go ahead.
No, I was thinking like Cobalt and companies can get Jenny D to endorse their products or be in commercials, but they have to pay for it. And these are companies that are also fairly large. Like Cobalt, Pazzo, etc. And they're not super profitable companies despite that. Like, I've looked at the back end on the profit margins on a lot of this stuff.
Right.
The other thing I would add to it is, like, we shouldn't pretend influencers are organic when there's an algorithm driving their engagement, and that the algorithm can be affected by pay. That's
very true. That's very true.
So-
So it's a pretty gloom and doom scenario. So we're up against the hour. Before we sign off, Baron, do you have anything to tell our audience about? Anything upcoming? Anything they should be paying attention from you?
Well, you can come out and meet me in LA on the 21st, and I think tickets will still be available when this hits the airwaves on the 15th. So, or whenever it's 15th, the 12th or the 19th.
Yeah.
In 2 weeks on a Wednesday.
Yeah.
So you can come out and see me there. It's at the Telegram Ballroom, and you can go to This Is Revolution's website for information on tickets and whatnot. Other than that, I got a bunch of serious stuffy stuff coming out about like indigenous issues and political economy and the kind of boring stuff that I do that gets about 1,000 views on YouTube. So way loud on the order of scale because it's depressing, and that's what I'm doing, and I'm continue doing it over at VarnVlog, and that's all I gotta plug.
Baron, anything to plug? Any plugging?
No, I'm kind of in a holding pattern right now. My summer was exceptionally busy, and I'm just trying to get my head back above water. I've got a lot of stuff that I want to do. I think I'm actually I'm thinking through hiring some kind of a production assistant or a content coordinator or something like that. So I guess keep your eyes and ears out for something like that if you're interested. I might start putting out a call for resumes here in the next month or so. But yeah, I'm slowing down to speed up right now. I don't really I've got a few ideas that I want to do, but I don't want to overcommit myself. So,
well, a wise man. Well,
yeah.
Thank you for joining us. I hope you do consider joining us again in the future. And as we say on TIR, we are